You know, quite a few people have said to me, "Hey Ed, you should cover the Convair B-36 bomber. That's a forgotten aircraft." And truth be told, I probably will do a video on the B-36 one day, because it really was such a beast. I mean, look at it in comparison to the B-29, which was hardly a Cessna itself. But is the B-36 a proper forgotten aircraft? I mean, with so many requests that I cover it, not really. Do you know what is a forgotten aircraft? This, the Convair XC-99, the transport version of the B-36 that makes its giant sibling look like a proper lightweight. And as I am sure I don't need to tell you, the requirements for both aircraft essentially began at the same time. In early 1941, the United States was progressing in the development of their next generation of heavy bomber, which was required to have unprecedented range. Designs that ultimately resulted in the Boeing B-29 and the consolidated B-32. But it was also feared that the United Kingdom may still at that time fall to Nazi Germany, in which case, should the United States find itself at war with Germany, it would have limited means to prosecute any offensive. I mean, I'm sure that the US Navy had their opinions on this issue, but they seem to have been overlooked. The United States Army Air Force, the USAAF, wanted a bomber that could strike Europe from the continental United States. When America found itself fighting Japan in late 1941 across the vast expanses of the Pacific, this further reinforced the need for a super long range bomber, and development of what became the B 36 progressed steadily, if perhaps never as an urgent priority. And Consolidated, which became Convair in 1943, the company responsible for the new mega bomber, thought that the basic design might not just prove useful as a fighting machine, but also as the basis for a truly massive long range transport. Thus was created the XC-99. Concept and design work started in 1942, shortly after the B-36, which makes sense considering that the XC-99 was to use the same wings and power plant allied to a new fuselage. And that fuselage was extremely impressive. The XC-99 was to have a truly huge structure, which measured 182 feet and 6 inches long, while the wingspan was 230 feet. Cargo capacity was massive for the day, with the original intention being that the double-deck aircraft would be able to carry 400 troops, more than 300 stretchers with attendants, or a payload of up to 100,000 pounds, all in a pressurized cabin, and be able to do this over huge distances. I mean, it's not quite comparable, but Convair practically invented the 747 20 years before Boeing. Such a massive machine naturally took a while to create, especially as the company was flat out building aircraft like the ubiquitous B-24, and the sheer size of the aircraft required it to be made in sections at different locations, with the wings built in Fort Worth, Texas, and then transported to San Diego in California, where they were matched up to the fuselage. The XC-99 was actually 20 feet longer, and its tail was 10 feet higher than the already huge B-36, and the sheer size of the plane meant that it had to be finished outside, as no building at Convair was high enough to house the giant aircraft with its main landing wheels installed, or wide enough to house it with outer wing panels in place. The wings, as said the same as those used on the first models of B-36, had 6 of the massive Pratt & Whitney R4340-41 Wasp major engines. These 28-cylinder air-cooled radials each produced 3,500 horsepower, and, mounted in the same distinctive push configuration as its bomber sibling, gave the XC-99 a top speed of 307 miles per hour. With existing workload and the complexities of the new aircraft, it wasn't until November 1947 that the XC-99 first took to the air. However, it was at that time the most capable transport aircraft in terms of payload, and would ultimately be the biggest piston engine aircraft the United States ever built. In comparison to the Douglas C-74 Globemaster, the United States' closest comparable heavy transport aircraft at the time, the XC-99 could carry more than double the maximum payload and around 4 times the number of personnel in troop transport. In addition, the huge undercarriage Convair developed for the aircraft meant that it could land on the same runways as the much smaller C-54, which was the USAF's principal transport of the day. Initially, the landing gear featured huge single tyres, but this would be switched during the XC-99 service life for the same four-wheel system as used on production B-36s. It wasn't until the end of May 1949 that the USAF took delivery of the XC-99 and followed Convair's own extensive testing with more of a year of their own. Considering how large, impressive, and cutting edge the XC-99 was, such a long test program isn't really surprising, but it obviously worked out well enough because on the first official cargo mission the aircraft flew, it carried freight with a total weight of 101,266 pounds, greater than the design maximum. Indeed, the XC-99 soon exceeded this, and from then on was employed in service that saw it in constant use all over the world, commonly carrying even heavier loads. One of its regular runs was between San Diego and Texas, carrying components used by the B-36 fleet. But the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 saw the XC-99 employed heavily carrying freight that was destined for the combat zone, including one emergency delivery of 42 engines for C-54s that were employed in the theatre. According to the US Air Force, between July 1951 and May 1952, the big aircraft flew 600 hours and airlifted £7 million of equipment and supplies. That's more than 3,000 metric tons, of which around half went to supporting the forces in Korea. To top it all off, and despite its size, the XC-99 was also apparently a nice plane to fly, and even, according to aircrews, surprisingly good to handle on the ground, being capable of backing easily into parking areas with its reversible props. Outside of Korea, the XC-99 was used for heavy lift operations in support of US forces in Europe, on one famous occasion flying between the United States and Germany via Bermuda and the Azores, and then back again. And it did this 12,000-mile trip, carrying more than 60,000 pounds each way. It was also used extensively in flights to Iceland, delivering critical components and personnel to the new distant early warning line system that was being constructed in the Arctic. The constant use of the XC-99 was only occasionally interrupted by important upgrades, which saw the aircraft receive improved engines, undercarriage, and the fitting of an AN/APS-42 weather radar with its distinctive thimble radome on the nose in 1953. There was no denying that this behemoth of a plane made an impression, especially when it showed up at air shows. In one famous example at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a woman asked the pilot how they moved the gargantuan. When he told her they flew it, she retorted, "Young man, what kind of a fool do you take me for?" The XC-99 was also surprisingly cheap to operate. In 1953, the aircraft flew 200 missions at an average cost of 13 cents per ton-mile, which the USAF calculated was less than half the ton-mile cost of its contemporaries. Indeed, so impressive did the aircraft seem that Convair began to market a civilian variant, the Convair Model 37. This would have been slightly longer than the XC-99 and been capable of carrying 204 passengers over 4,200 miles. And this was close to becoming reality, as Pan American Airlines actually ordered 15 for use on their New York to London route. There was just one proviso. For manufacture to be economically viable, Convair would need a production order for the C-99 as it would have been in service. And that never happened, because just like the B-36, the writing was on the wall about where the future lay, which was in jets, and arguably turboprops, but they are, in comparison to the piston radials of the XC-99, essentially the same thing. Though using many of the components from the B-36 might have seemed a perfectly logical choice at the time of the XC-99's development, the short production and lifespan of that bomber, replaced by the B-52 essentially by 1955, meant that the obvious obsolescence of the XC-99 in the face of new technology was all too apparent. In 1956, the Douglas C-133 Cargo Master flew for the first time. This turbine-powered aircraft could carry more weight than the XC-99 over similar distances at quicker speeds, all with the benefit of a continuous and fully open cargo deck, in contrast to the XC-99's awkward twin-deck configuration. The pending introduction of the new turboprop and then jet transports meant that in March 1957 the US Air Force decided they no longer needed the big aircraft and it was removed from service. In total, the XC-99 had flown 1.5 million miles and logged more than 7,400 flying hours. It had also transported more than 27,215 metric tons of cargo. Not bad in a 7-year service life. The XC-99 was also important in giving the US Air Force experience in what it needed from its future strategic airlifters, an element of its history that is easy to overlook. After all, when it flew, there was no other transport that really came close to it. So, I hear you ask, what happened to this great monster of an aircraft? Well, it is still with us. Kind of. The XC-99 was for many decades on display at Kelly Air Force Base in Texas. In 2004, it was decided to move it to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, a process that required the aircraft be broken down and transported in parts, an operation that was completed in 2008. And then, problems. Unfortunately, the XC-99 used a lot of magnesium alloy in its construction, and that apparently did not age at all well. In fact, the level of restoration required is, by all accounts, prohibitive, with the aircraft needing major structural parts to be replaced. In an effort to preserve the rapidly deteriorating airframe, the broken down XC-99 was moved to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, the famous boneyard, where it waits until enough resources can be mustered to begin the process of restoration. If this occurs, then it can be shipped to whichever museum may be lucky enough to house it, put back together, and bask once again in the adoration of enthralled onlookers, just as it did in the 50s. But to be honest, it doesn't look hopeful. The level of work and expense needed to restore this unique aircraft has not been forthcoming for years now, and though there is always talk of its preservation, it always seems to be just talk. I can't really blame the various authorities, there is always more things requiring money than money to go around. But it does seem a real shame, because the XC-99 really is a truly magnificent, forgotten aircraft.